Okay, guys. Now we are discussing about gastric secretion. What is the estimate for the gastric secretion? It is 2.5 liter per day. In one day, we produce approximately 2.5 liter of the gastric secretions. Now, most importantly, the gastric secretions, gastric means stomach. So, these secretions are all that are being produced in the stomach. In stomach, the food is being stored. So while it is being stored, it is mixed with these secretions, and these secretions mainly include the acid, the mucus, and the pepsin. These are the major gastric secretions that act on this food that is being stored for some while in the stomach. These three things act upon the food, and the product formed is chyme. The product form is chyme, and this chyme is released into the duodenum at a very steady rate, at a very controlled rate. Now come back to the gastric secretions. If we look upon the gastric secretions according to anatomic considerations, in the anatomic considerations we can say that the cardiac region and the pyloric region, these two regions of the stomach, mainly produce mucus, because the glands residing in these two regions mainly produce mucus, whereas the body and the fundus of the stomach have glands, and in these glands we have two types of cells. These two types of cells include parietal cells and chief cells. The other name for the parietal cells is oxyntic cells, and the second name for chief cells is zymogen cells. Now these parietal cells secrete this acid, and that acid is usually HCl. Plus they secrete intrinsic factor. We will soon discuss the function of intrinsic factor. Now what about these chief cells, these zymogen cells? They will secrete pepsinogens. Why we call them zymogen cells? Because zymogens mean inactive enzymes. It means ultimately it will be producing inactive enzymes, and this pepsinogen is an inactive enzyme that will acted upon by this HCl and will be further converted into pepsin, and this mucus was being produced by the cardiac and the pyloric regions of the stomach. In the body and the fundus, the glands are not only having these two cells, they are also having mucus cells in the neck, in these all. The neck cells in the glands of these regions will also give you mucus. All these secretions all these secretions are secreted in gastric pit. It is a common chamber where several of these glands open. Now, the surface that is having these glands is like this. These are the deep glands. Now, from here to here, we are having cells. We also call them surface mucous cells. We also call them surface mucous cells. And these cells not only produce mucus, they also produce trefoil peptides. We will further discuss this. Trefoil peptides along with the bicarbonate secretion. So these surface mucous cells will be ultimately producing this mucus, trefoil peptides and the bicarbonates. Now, when the gastric secretions are being secreted, the concept is that the stomach readies itself to receive the meal before it is actually taken in. And that is known as cephalic phase of secretion, cephalic phase of gastric secretion. This phase is before meal. And in this phase, the stomach is getting ready for the uptake of meal. Until yet we are not having the meal ingested, it is the phase that is before meal. In this phase, the stomach only gets ready for the uptake of food. Then ultimately we are having the second phase of gastric secretion, that is actually the gastric phase. In this gastric phase, secretions are being secreted. We are having all those previously discussed secretions in this gastric phase, and this phase is quantitatively the most significant. This phase is quantitatively the most significant. Now ultimately we'll be having the third phase of gastric secretion, that is intestinal phase. And what happens in this phase, simply the meal leaves the stomach and enters duodenum. It is so simple. Now what are the regulating factors we will further discuss, but for a short note, the regulating factors for these three phases are local as well as distant triggers. Means the triggers for the intestinal phase does not necessarily be present around the intestine. It will come, it can come from anywhere. Distant, local as well, that are present in the intestine.